Hi friends, my name is Vasily and this video is part of the Minimal API course series where we are building a REST API for a habit tracker mobile application using industry's best practices. Today we are going to continue the previous video's topic and add endpoints for the habit tracker API. Before we go ahead with the coding part, I would like to cover a couple of things about the structure of our API. This is a really basic API, so I'm going to approach it like a basic solution. So first of all, we have the API layer, which is represented by controller, fast endpoints or minimal APIs, which are our case, business logic layer, which is usually services or mediator handlers, which became really popular a couple of years ago. Then we have the data access layer, which in our case is an ORM, entity framework, or an API broker if you have your data source as an external API. As said, this is the most basic example of how you could structure your API. There are other alternatives like clean architecture, hexagonal, and a bunch of others. For our case, the habit tracker API is really small, so this clean approach would suffice in my opinion. And one more thing, this is vertical layering. So we have an API, we have business logic, we have data access logic, and then we have the resource that we are accessing. In our case, it's a SQL server hosted inside a Docker container, but horizontal layering usually does not suffice. In large applications, you are going to have vertical slices. In our case, it's going to be first the habit part, and then we are going to cover the user management. Why do I split it in half, like habits and then user management? Because you might package up your user management services and your user management call into NuGet packages and reuse that component inside other applications. You might split up your user management to a separate API and then have, for example, you might have some expenses tracking application that would reuse the same user management component and basically have two applications, the habit and the expenses. The applications might scale differently. For example, the habit part might require more compute power than the user management part. It's all covered under the holy word "it depends." But usually the best approach is to define your boundaries, your vertical boundaries straight on from the get-go. So in our case, these boundaries will be two, the user management part and the habits part. So we are going to use the client mobile application, which I've covered in the first video, which is not really done by us, but wait. And then we are building the web API, which will be, let's say, the glue between these two components. So we are going to have a user management vertical slice and a habits vertical slice. Both will have unit tests, integration tests, and both will expose the habits contracts. These two usually might get shipped as NuGet packages to other solutions, and all the communication to the user management part will be covered in the contracts, and all the communication with the habits part will be covered in the habits contracts. So without further ado, let's get straight over here and add a directory called habits. We are going to split it into a separate class library later, but for now a folder structure would suffice. Move the data part over here and the contracts into the habits. In the previous video we've covered the data part, so we've created an application DbContext, all the data models, and we have also the contracts for the API, and we have the iHabit service, which is basically the business logic layer over here that we have, which is exposed through the API. For now, the habit service is really a simple empty implementation, so I've removed all the in-memory stuff that we've had previously in it, and this is basically everything that we will need to implement. So the first thing that we are going to do is basically inject over here the application DbContext this, and I'm going to mark it as read-only and generate a simple constructor. Sorry, I missed. Okay, so a small explanation is overdue here. Why I'm injecting the implementation details of ORM, in our case entity framework, directly into the business logic layer. Usually in big applications, the data access layer would be covered by an interface, abstracted away, sorry, by an interface that you would consume. In big applications, the data access layer can be split apart from the business logic part, and it can scale separately from the business logic. In our case, this would be an overkill since the business logic layer is really thin and I don't plan on expanding it too much, but in big enterprise solutions, the approach that I adhere to is really abstract away the data access layer and as well have a well-defined contract for the business logic layer. So let's get back to it. We have the iHabitService interface, which would go into the contracts part, and we have the implementation itself. Back to implementation, what I want to do right here is basically create a habit data. So new habit data model, and pass in over here the name of the habit of the that I'm getting from here, and then I'm just calling the application DbContext habits add async and pass in here the habit, then application DbContext SaveChangesAsync and return habit.id. Make this method async and over here call them with an await. So this is basically everything that we need for the add habit async. I want to add the get habit async API method. For that, I'm basically retrieving the habit from the habits table and calling the find async. Over here you can send over the ID of the entity and then the cancellation token. I'm going to mark this as an async and over here await. So this would get us the habit. If habit is null, then we want to return null response. For now, that's how we are going to handle it. And over here, return new habit, and in here, pass in the name of the habit that we've retrieved from the database. And I don't really need this one. For now, this is how we are going to handle these two methods. I don't need this one over here. So what are we going to do next is we are going to return to the program, and before we would add the endpoints over here into the Program.cs, I don't like that approach at all. So what we are going to do is basically over here add a small class called endpoints. Well, let's name it habit endpoints, which is going to be a static class. I don't need it to be public. And over here, internal void add habit endpoints. And this would extend the web application app. I need it to be a static as well. And with that, I just want to assign it to a group. And here, group map post. I need that like this. Async. I want a habit from the models. Habit habit service, and over here I'm just calling await service add habit async, and I'm passing in the habit. And for the second one, it's group map get with an ID of type int, and then over here I'm just calling async. Oh, sorry, a little bit overkill like this. And over here int ID, I need a habit service as well. And as well, I want a cancellation token, lowercase this one, call the method by await service get habit async, pass in the ID and the cancellation token, and then just lower it. Okay, so I think I forgot to add over here the ID of the habit itself, so I'm going to do that. And yeah, in the Program.cs right now I need to add this habit endpoints. So for that I'm going to add map habit endpoints. Yeah, by the way, behind the scenes I've renamed this from add to map for a second, since map is a better name for it. And this should let us debug the solution itself. So I'm going to run debug and I'm going to open Data Studio. So yeah, over here we have an .NET Learning habit with an ID of 1, and if I open Postman I should be able to retrieve it as soon as the application starts. So it started, and if I run it by 1, yeah, it takes a while. Slow PC on my end, so it got me out the ID 1 and named .NET Learning, and we can try to send a post request, new habit I want to track. And if I send it, we have an exception. Basically an error occurred while saving entity changes, and it's basically the user ID. So it could not insert an user ID into the entry. This is expected, and usually what people would do is basically in here make use of read-only token service. So token service, and in here initialize it from constructor, and for user ID it's basically token get user ID. And this will work if I debug it right now and go back to Postman, and as soon as the solution starts up I will be able to add it. So if I send it right now, we have a 2007 response. If I go to the habit part right now and just run it, we have a habit with a 2007 ID, and if I take it over here and go 2007, send, yeah, new habit I want to track. This is an okay approach right now. So we get the token service, we get the user ID from it, but if you remember previously we've added this same token service back to our application DbContext. What can we do to enhance it is basically remove it from here. I don't really need it over here, and I don't want to have to specify it every time. What I want to do now is basically go to application DbContext, in here public override SaveChangesAsync with a cancellation token. So over here it's something that we are doing in big applications. We usually have a base entity model which has the created at, modified by modified at, some other data that is used for auditing purposes. We can take that approach and use it over here into the save changes. So I'm going to paste over here a set of sort modifiers. So a small piece of code. What we are basically getting is from the change tracker, we are getting the entries list. Then we are filtering and see which entities are of type habit data model, and if the entry state was added, we are calling the token service to set up the user ID, or if it was modified, we might update some data modification. If you would have a base model that would have a created date created by property over here, you could use this same approach that I'm describing over here, and instead of habit data model you would have your base model, audit model, or whatever you call it in your solution, and then just based on the type, on the entity state, you would modify the selected properties. I'm going right now to close all the tabs since it's getting out of hand and go back to my endpoint definition over here. What we want to do right now is basically add validation. So I'm going to use a NuGet package for that. If you see right now, it's basically using Fluent validation, and Fluent validation depends in action. I want to add one more package, which is called O9D ASP.NET Fluent validation. This package is written by Ben Foster and is a package that we are using in some of our minimal APIs. If you remember previously, as part of this API course, I've covered the validation filters. I'll add a link to that part somewhere over here or over here. What we are doing now is adding a NuGet package to do just that programmatically, and I don't need to type all that code. So, and it has a couple of neat extensions. So for that to work, I need to add here with validation filter, and I just need to pass in a validate tag attribute, and just if I debug the solution right now, here remove the text API to start, it will basically validate and return the problem details with a 422 unprocessable entity response with the name must not be empty, which is really neat since we've added only one line of code over here and an attribute for that. So we don't need to write the validation filter ourselves. But yeah, if you haven't watched that part, it's really important, not just from the perspective of validation, but how filters and middleware works as is inside an minimal API. So I'm going to stop it right now. And over here, we want to add some more stuff. So first of all, we want to specify that it accepts a habit, and over here, the content type. Let me just make my life easier somewhat and add a constant class over here, public static string application JSON, which is basically application JSON. So I want to use in here constants dot content types application JSON. What I want to do next, so I need a tool1 as well, produces validation problem with name, create habit. Why I'm using this with name is basically because later down the road I want to make use of named endpoints to create links to specific API endpoints. So over here, what's the next part is basically cut this, paste it like this. So var habit ID equals await service at habit async, and I want to generate a link to the map get part. So for now, I'm going to with name here basically get habit. This is everything for now. So if I want to create a link to this get habit endpoint, I could do it one of the following ways. So the most straightforward and clean for me is basically in here inject the link generator, which is basically link generator. So I want to make use of this, and inside here var path equals link generator dot get path by name, and pass in the get habit endpoint name, pass in here a new ID equals habit ID like this, and return results created, and in here path, and the object itself is basically the habit. So if I debug the solution right now, and meanwhile I'll open Postman, what I'm interested in is the headers part, and in here if I press like new habit each tag 2, the API is already running, and I send the request itself. I should see over here the new location part of the habit, so it's habit 2010, which is over here, and this is the API endpoint that we have for retrieval. We can get this one step further, and in here we can also inject the DbContext, which basically would allow us to get a complete path to the habit itself. So link generator get URI by name, and in here specify the context, get habit ID itself, and use this complete path in the created at, debug the solution, open Postman again, and I just want to have new habit 3. Just wait a second for the solution to load up and send the habit, and right now I should see the full location of the habit itself. So I have HTTPS localhost 7113 and basically the whole path where I can find the habit itself. So if I go over, if I just let me copy this, paste it here, send a GET request, I get the new habit back. And I'm going to do the same for the GET habit behind the scenes. So this basically, first of all, produces 404 if it's not found, and then produces a habit with a 200, which is the basic status code that we can use. Return results not found, and run the request. Once again, I get a 404 over here. So yeah, right now what's left is for me just to remove this one, rename the complete path to just path. Next, just to basically move the service part to the habits. Okay, this was the end of the video. Press the like, the subscribe button, and the share. It helps me a lot. And until the next part comes out, I'll link a couple of videos over here or over here to some other topics that I've covered on my channel. Stay tuned.